Welcome to Lesson 2 of the AQS Let's Quilt series. This class is our 6 quilts in 6 weeks, and we're working with panels. And in our last class we had Mickey and Minnie Mouse, and so this one I chose a floral design, and this is a panel called Venice Flowers by Robert Kaufman, and it does come with some companion prints, and I bought 2 of those to go with this. But then when I got ready to start working on the borders, I thought I needed a little bit of that red that's in there and a little bit of that blue that's in there. So I added 2 more borders. So you can see the 4 colors that I've chosen. And the red obviously is going to be the smallest border. It will be our framing border that we put around the entire panel before we add the other borders with cornerstones. But you can see that I've cut all of my strips, and the first one is 1.5 inches wide. The second one is 2.5 inches wide with 2.5 inch squares for the cornerstones, 3 inches wide and 3-inch cornerstones, and 3.5 inches for the outside one, so that they just get progressively bigger. Now, on this one, you remember I told you in the first class that you want to measure some element in the center, and so I measured the big flowers, and you can see that they're about little more than 5 inches across. So I knew as long as I stayed 4 inches or less, I could have a series of borders and that it would be in scale with what's happening in this panel. So what did I do first? The very first thing I did was straighten the panel. Well, you remember in the Mickey and Minnie panel, I pinned all along the edges. Well, on this one, it was not very out of square, so I pinned the selvage. The top and the bottom was the selvage. I pinned those together, and then I straightened it. And you can see from the little bits, it was a little bit crooked. You can see that it kind of went down there at an angle. So those were the sides, and the top and bottom wasn't very much, but it still needed to be trimmed. So that's all the trimming I had to do on this one. Okay, all right, so the next thing that we will be working on will be adding the framing border around the center. And before we do that, we're going to take a short word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back and start on the borders.
The Ironmatics Space Saver is an award-winning ironing board. It's ergonomic and user-friendly. Strap your iron directly to it and hang it behind a door or in a wardrobe to keep it hidden out of the way. Visit ironmatic.com to get yours today.
Okay, so we're ready now to start measuring for our first border. Now, I will tell you, as I pressed this panel, I also sprayed it with that quilting spray, just because that helps it, keeps it from being quite so wobbly. This fabric is a little bit different than our quilting cotton, so I've sprayed it, and you can see that it behaves pretty well. So I folded it in half, top to bottom, so that I could measure and see how long I need to cut the first border. And it's 22 inches. Well, I've already cut those borders, but I want to show you what I did. Because 22 inches means it needs to be 44 inches, and often our fabric is not a true 44 inches. So I have already spliced in, let me find it here, I've already spliced in a piece. I just cut an extra border and sewed on a tail. Now, you don't want that to be at 43 inches so that you have a splice right there. So what I did was I just folded it in half and then I just cut it at an uneven space. You can see, okay, so I cut that much off so that that splice is going to be in the middle of the border and it's not going to be right close to that corner. Okay, so now I'm ready to sew the border onto the quilt, and you just have to have that splice in there and make sure you know that's the wrong side. I'm going to sew it down the side so that splice needs to be facing up. And just because this is a pretty long seam, I am going to put a few pins in here. So I'll start by putting it at each end. Now I didn't do it this time, but normally I would mark the halfway on that border so that I could, oh, and do you see what I just did? You always want to double check that, because do you see I have my piece turned? You know, I have to tell you, I get more comments from people who are watching this series who tell me they like it when I tell them something I goofed up on. You know what? There's so many things, there's so many pieces and parts. Now it's all flat. There's so many pieces and parts that, you know, things just happen. But you know what? Because it's fabric, there isn't very much that we can't fix. And I'm just going to put these pins in here maybe about every 6 inches. And I will pin it where I made that splice, just because I pressed that seam allowance open. And I just want to make sure that the seam allowance stays put. So I'm going to put it kind of at an angle to catch both sides of it there. Okay, so now I'm ready to go to the machine and sew this side on. When you get your handout, when you print out your handout, there's some lines on here. So when you do those measurements, all right, so there's a line on here for the measurement that I just took here. So I'm going to say 1/2 equals 22 inches or 44 inches total. You want to write that down because you probably are going to want to remember it, and sometimes by the time you get to the sewing machine or get over here to cut it, you don't remember exactly what size that was. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about my machine before I get started here. I have a 50 weight thread for piecing. I have my stitch length at 2.0, and I have the 1/4 inch foot on the sewing machine. Again, I never sew over pins, so I'm going to stop and remove that pin. Oh, actually, I'm going to hang on to this one because it's the one with my seam allowances, and I want to sew right up to it before I pull it. There we go. And I'm a real proponent of using a thread saver. So this is just a piece of fabric. I folded it in half so I can sew onto it. If you get in the habit of using one of those, you'll save yourself a lot of thread. Okay, so that's one of the side borders on. Let's go ahead and pin the second side border on. This time I am going to put a pin. It would be easier to make sure you've got that in the middle of your quilt. And so I'll put a pin in this border as well so I can match those up. One thing you don't want to do when you sew on borders is you don't want to just cut a long strip and start at the top and sew to the bottom, because I can tell you, because of the way the sewing machine feeds, sometimes the bottom will feed more fabric than the top. The top fabric most of the time is just floating along on the top. So I would recommend that you do always cut it to size. So you see, by putting that pin in at the midpoint, it actually is real easy to see that this lays just like you want it to. Well, okay, so now you get to see what I did again, because I have it upside down. This is the right side of my fabric. Okay, we're ready to sew the second one on. Okay, so now the next step is for us to press this seam, set the seams, first of all, of the stitching that we just did, and then we'll press this border open. And I'm just going to press the seam allowances toward the border. Okay, so now, before we can cut the top and bottom borders, again, we need to measure. And this is longer than my ruler, so again, I'm going to fold it in half. And measure. And so I'm at 12 3/4 inches. So that would be 2 times 12 3/4 inches. 12 3/4 is half. So it's going to be 24 plus 1 1/2, or 25 1/2 inches is what I need to cut the border. Okay, do you see how I did that? You just need to measure the top plus the border, and I measured half, so I have to take it times 2. 12 3/4 equals 25 1/2 inches. Okay, so now let's take my other 2 borders. I'm going to do these 2 at a time. I'm just going to lay them one on top of the other. And I need to measure 12 3/4 inches. So there's 3/4. And here's my sometimes I cut these with scissors, but I actually think it's a little more accurate if we just lay a ruler on here and use our rotary cutter. And now we're ready to pin this to the top of the quilt. And I don't have any seams in this one, so I don't have to worry about getting it upside down. And while I'm pinning, I'm going to go ahead and pin the bottom one, and then I can sew both of those in one swoop. Okay, now I'm ready to sew. Okay, so now we'll go back to the iron. We'll set the seam. And now we'll press that border open. Okay, we have border number 1 all on our panel. Goes all the way around, and this is really what I call a framing border, as we haven't done anything special to it. We've just framed the inside of the panel. We're going to take a short break for our sponsors, and when I come back, we're going to work on the second border, which has cornerstones.
As any artist will tell you, hitting the perfect notes means finding the perfect instrument, Bernina. So get the machine that always hits the right chord and start making beautiful music together. Bernina, made to create.
Tracy's Tables has all of your custom sewing table needs. Visit tracystables.com to see the complete line of unique tables, carts, and shelves. And all of Tracy's tables are made in the USA.
All right, now we're ready to start on border number 2. And this one has cornerstones. And a cornerstone is a block that you put in the corner like that. Okay? So you can go ahead and measure both directions when you get ready to do a border with cornerstones. And I've already done that, and I folded it in half, and my length was 23 inches. That was half. So my border needs to be cut 46 inches total. And then the top, you can see that when we add on a cornerstone to the top, we can use the same measurement that we just did of that last border and bottom to it. So it was 12 3/4 or 25 1/2. So I've cut my borders to those sizes, and I just get rid of my trimmings here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sew the cornerstones onto both ends of the top and bottom, and then we'll have that all ready to go when we get ready to sew that on. So I have 4 cornerstones, and so these are my top and bottom pieces. So I'm going to make sure I have the right side of my fabric here, and Okay, I'm going to go ahead and iron those while my iron is good and hot. Okay, so now those are ready to go when we get the sides on. So that'll be the next step. I'm going to mark the halfway point. Okay, and let's do the same thing with the panel. Okay, now I'm going to double check this time to make sure I have the right sides together here so that I don't have to repin all this. And my splice is facing up, so we're in good shape there. Okay, so now we're ready to take it to the iron and do some pressing. Okay, so now we're ready to add the top and bottom borders with the cornerstones. And again, I'm going to fold them in half and mark it. And we'll do the same thing with our panel. I can't stress enough how important it is for you to measure at each step of the way and cut your borders to that size. You'll find that your work will, your finished quilt will look so much nicer if you've really measured and made those borders fit your quilt. Now let's make sure that we've got our seam allowances pointing up. They are. That's a good first step, isn't it? match up our corners. Now, this is one point where you will want to match up the, and I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back and I'm going to repress these cornerstones so that the seam allowances are going toward the blue, so I can nest those seams. And you'll be glad you did that, because otherwise it makes a real thick seam to sew over. And so now I can take those two seams. You see right there how I have them together? And you can feel when those seams are locked in there together. I'm sure you're seeing me. Every once in a while I'll pull this back just to make sure that I'm right on the edge of that red fabric. Okay, so there are cornerstones. And why would we use cornerstones? Well, I'm using the same red that I used for the inside frame in all three of the other borders to lead your eye right back to the middle of the quilt. So by using color that way, we can lead our eye. You can lead color with light against dark. In this case, it's repeating a color outside and bringing your eye right back into the middle. Now I'll go ahead and finish border number 2, and you just need to know that border number 3 and border number 4 are put on exactly the same way as border number 2. I don't think you need to sit here and watch me sew 2 more borders on. It's done exactly the same way. So now you can see I have added on borders 3 and borders 4. And one of the things you want to remember to do is to measure top to bottom for the side borders and across for the top and bottom borders. And one other little tip I'll give you is just pay attention to how you press the seam allowances for your cornerstones, because they're going to alternate. You want to make sure you can nest those seams. It'll make it a lot easier for you to sew. Now we have our Venice Flowers panel all done, and 4 borders, framing border, and 3 borders with cornerstones. So I hope you're having as much fun doing these panels as I am. Do you know, I remember back in a long time ago, we used to call these cheater claws. And mostly they were printed a whole quilt and then somebody just quilted them up, or about all we could find was maybe some panels that were baby quilts, and there still are lots of those out there. But these that are printed digitally certainly have given us a whole new avenue for making quilts. And I'm making, this one's a wall quilt. When we get to the end of the session, we'll be making one that is a bed-size quilt or a big throw. It's going to be Quilting Santa, if you haven't seen that one. We have another floral one that we're going to do that's a little bit different. I have a patriotic one, and I have an eagle one. You know, sometimes it's hard to figure out what to do with these panels that are horizontal, and so it's longer this way and short this way. They make absolutely great wheelchair quilts, and so we're going to do that in one of our later lessons. So before I go today, I just want to encourage you to continue on and add borders to your panel and make your quilt your design. And I can't wait for you to post some of these pictures of what you're doing on the AQS Facebook page. You know, we show this program on Facebook, and we'd love to have you post some pictures of your panel quilts right there. Now, another thing you may not know, and that is all of these classes end up on the AQS channel on YouTube.com. Our channel there is called Quilt TV, and that's where all of these classes that we've done, this is the 6th class now that we've done, and they're all free. So I encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to go look at those, to go do that. And don't forget to sign up for the AQS Let's Quilt giveaway. All of these sponsors that we have, Bernina Branson, where we'll be doing a show in March, Panasonic's Iron, Ironmatic ironing board, and I don't know if I talked about this, but one of the things about this ironing board cover is that there's a layer of cotton, a layer of felt, and then the cover, and so it retains that heat when you put your iron on it, makes it a little easier to iron. Tracy's Tables and starforest.com. We have a panel that we've got from them, and they'll be providing some of the prizes that are in our giveaway. So in the description of this class, you'll find the link to go look at that. And if you go watch us on YouTube, I'd encourage you to subscribe, and that way every time we post a new video, you'll get an email to let you know that there's a new video up there on Quilt TV. So with that, we'll be doing another panel next time, and can't wait to have you join us there, and we'll do something completely different from this one. Be sure to post those pictures now. We want to see what you're making too. See you next time.